Good afternoon, Professor Carey. This is Michael Lawson, and this is my video on torture and interrogations. Here we have Mr. Black, and he's going to give us his perspective on the topic. So, as you know, Mr. Black, in 1994, UN Convention states that torture means any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted. Do you agree with that definition, and do you think that should be allowed in interrogations?
Yes, I do agree with that definition, and yes, I do think it should be allowed.
Now, is that coming from a civilian or a veteran of the armed forces?
From a veteran who's actually served in the Iraq war theater.
Okay. And why or why not should torture be allowed in interrogations?
Simply my opinion is that in times of war, things are simply different. You can try to coach a strategy and follow a simple strategy, but in reality, you have to be able to adapt and improvise and overcome the situation. While you'd like to have good ground intelligence, sometimes you just don't have that, and it may be wrong. And so torture allows the military to find things and develop information and actually make better decisions as to what they should do to save lives.
So what about the opponents of torture who claim that such barbaric and we'll discuss what actually you consider torture, these interrogation tactics take place? The opponents of torture claim that the wrong intelligence is being gathered from these techniques, and that people will just simply tell you anything to make the pain stop.
I'd say most likely those proponents probably haven't participated in it. They've only seen pieces of it, and because they've seen what they've seen, they formulated an opinion. But I believe that if you talk to most military personnel, which is why it's still used, you will find that there are actionable intelligence items that can be developed from those techniques if they're done correctly.
Do you think that if torture is necessary in an interrogation, do you think that that is an illustration of a failure in other sophisticated forms of intelligence or rudimentary forms such as spies and, paid informants, etc.?
Not necessarily, because even spies can be,
deceived,
and there's such thing as disinformation, which is, in a lot of cases, if the particular enemy just figures that there's a spy, a lot of times they will feed disinformation to throw them off. So you really don't know what you're getting anyway. It's about analyzing the intelligence and trying to develop the most sound scenarios, if you will.
Now, let me ask you this. It's common, as you said, in the military for individuals to deem torture okay in terms of interrogating terrorists. But what about if American citizens are discovered to have pertinent information? Is it okay to torture them on American soil?
Truthfully, I mean, my thing is, if you are participating in a mode against American or doing non-patriotic things, then most likely you're going to get caught in that scenario. I just find it hard to believe that someone who is truly an innocent citizen, and I'm pretty sure if you look at the data, it's rare, an innocent citizen just all of a sudden gets picked up and tortured. it's just unrealistic.
Right. But in the event that an American citizen is somehow involved in some capacity, and the powers that be determine that they do have information, would you condone torture to get the info?
Well, yes, because my opinion of a lot of things is about personal accountability. You dig your grave, you gotta lay in it.
Okay.
So if I'm bold enough to do things to demonstrate to individuals that I'm against what's happening in this country, and I'm willing to take certain actions against this country and against innocent Americans, then yeah, I think you deserve to be tortured just like anybody else.
How do you feel about waterboarding? Do you think waterboarding is torture? And I mean, you've already said that you feel that it should be allowed in interrogation. So, is waterboarding an act by which severe pain or suffering, physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted? Is waterboarding under that category?
I would say yes.
And do you think that it's a necessary tactic to try to get pertinent information?
I would say that it would depend on the individual.
Individual meaning the individual
person
administering
the person that's being tortured.
Okay.
Different people are going to respond differently to different torture techniques.
Mm-hmm.
Some people, you know, as you said before, you can waterboard them all day and they're not going to tell you anything.
Right.
So
right.
You know, it depends on the individual and what's necessary.
I hear you. And do you think if in the event that an individual that's being interrogated is discovered to be innocent and they were tortured, do you think they should be allowed to pursue the government for monetary compensation?
Yes, absolutely.
And do you think that that rule should apply in the continental United States and abroad as well, or just in the 50 U.S.
I would say only a true American citizen.
So, do you think torture is taking place at Guantanamo and other secret installations where terrorists are being held?
Yes, definitely. Torture is taking place in American prisons. Yeah.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, Ms. Robinson. I want to ask you your opinion on torture and interrogations. And before we get into it, I want to let you know that in 1994, the UN declared that torture means any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted. Do you agree with that definition of torture?
Yes, I do.
Do you think torture should or should not be allowed in interrogations?
I'm divided. I think there are times when you may have to take a by any means necessary approach to protect your country and find pertinent information. However, I'm torn because of the research or the claims that I've heard that torture may not give you a valid piece of information that you're looking for.
Right.
It may just be sufficient for the torture to stop.
Right. People tell you what you want to hear just
Basically.
to make the pain stop.
Yes.
Right. That's definitely what the opponents of torture say. The proponents of torture claim that they do get positive results and valid information from these tactics. Do you think waterboarding is considered torture or should be considered torture?
Definitely. If you are restricting a person's ability to breathe and, simulating a drowning experience, that's definitely an unpleasant situation.
Well, if we go by the definition laid out by the UN, do you think that simulating drowning is severe pain or suffering? Or do you think it's...
I think it would be. If you were in a drowning situation, you would be in a lot of suffering. Even though it may not be cutting off a limb or doing anything more physical, more bloody, more gory, it's definitely something that would put the person in high stress and could either, lead to some emotional torture, stress situation, or even like a heart attack or something.
But waterboarding is just simulating drowning. You're not actually drowning.
If you were tortured long enough, you kind of check out of reality, and whatever you're going through at that time becomes your reality. So even if it's a minor torture, I think that takes over your thought process, and the psychological aspect could make that seem greater than it really is.
What do you think about in the event that American citizens here on U.S. soil have pertinent information that's essential to national security? Do you think they should be allowed to torture Americans here on our own soil?
That raises a red flag because There's so many different things to consider with that.
They have a suspect,
Uh,
and they have determined through their own intelligence that this individual knows, where the bomb is.
mm-hmm.
And the bomb's set to go off at midnight, and it's 9 o'clock. Should law enforcement be allowed to torture this individual to get the location? Or should they just let it go up in smoke?
I'm torn. I mean, there may be some situations where that is necessary. But I just I'm throwing up red flags as far as the freedoms that we have, the rights that we have, and not knowing if there's anything set in place or that would be set in place to protect our rights and not let that get out of hand.
Do you think physical or psychological torture are more effective than one another, or coupled together?
I would say coupled together, but my opinion is always the psychological, because when you talk about the mind, which is what controls the body, it's all psychological. And when you really talk about pain, it's still psychological. I mean, there are some people who have psychologically conditioned themselves to not necessarily feel the type of pain or have a pain tolerance that's higher than others.
True.
So, psychologically though, if I can break you down and get into your head psychologically, that's more powerful in my mind than physically. First question, as a civilian, how do you feel about torture techniques?
As a civilian, I'm torn between the two, because morally, my first inclination would be not to torture someone,
Mm-hmm.
but when you're in a situation where you got millions of lives at stake, not even millions, hundreds of thousands, or even just hundreds, and people have pertinent information that they have, and they don't want to divulge it for whatever reason, I would condone certain, I want to say acts of torture, with certain techniques that would be considered torture, all in the name of intelligence. But the concern on my end is how to determine whether or not these individuals, really have this information. The most unfortunate thing is human beings are human and they make mistakes. So I'm convinced that some people that are being tortured in prisons in America and abroad, some of these individuals are innocent. And that's unfortunate that our intelligence is not sophisticated enough to where we have innocent people that are being tortured. But on the flip side, you got some bad people out here that have some information that'll save lives, and unfortunately some of them won't give it up unless they're put in painful predicaments. And I think that's one side of the coin that people need to consider, and even though I'm a civilian, from a military point of view, these people who are doing terrorist acts, they know what they're up to, they know what they're up against, and like I've been told from friends of mine in the military, if we were in their shoes, they would probably be torturing us, trying to get information. So do we want to be a step behind because we want to be the nice guys? I'm not so sure.
You think that waterboarding should be considered as torture?
As a civilian who hasn't been waterboarded or even seen one in person, my initial reaction would be to say, no, I don't think it's torture. I think it provides a simulation of drowning, like some people say, and which is potentially tremendously uncomfortable for people. But from my understanding, it doesn't have a possibility of imminent death, and it doesn't put a person's life in imminent danger. It's just a scary situation, and I definitely think that psychological torture can be sometimes more effective than physical pain with some individuals. Everybody is different, but that's up to the interrogator to determine, the subject of who they're interrogating.